All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know we've got several folks still hopping on. Happy Thursday and welcome to the Enlist Best Management Practices and Common Questions. Thanks for spending some time with us here this morning. My name is Kylie Nodine. I'm a field marketing manager with Corteva. I've got Katie Verrett and Jason Gibson with us, who are market development specialist with Corteva as well, and they're going to be leading you all through today's webinar. Just to get started here, just a quick recap of the agenda. So we'll do a quick 2025 Enlist Weed Control System season recap, just walk through what we saw, some successes we had. We'll talk about Enlist application updates and then do just a little bit of a general FAQ. We'll take time in between each of the sessions to do some Q&A. I did just want to let you guys know that the chat function is disabled. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function here on Zoom, and we will pause in between some of the updates to take some time to answer some questions. With that, Katie and Jason, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kylie, and thank you all for joining us here this morning. So some quick highlights. At the end of 2025, the Enlist E3 soybean platform is now planted on 65% of the U.S. soybean market. So an incredible accomplishment since 2017. A lot of you are enjoying the benefits of elite germplasm that comes with the Enlist trait, seeing some exceptional yields with our traded platform. Also, you have quite a bit of appreciation, I think, for the near zero volatility, the reduced drift features built into Enlist herbicides, as well as the tank mix flexibility with products like glufosinate. The nice thing with Corteva is from the very beginning, we've got universities as well as third-party people involved looking at both the trait and the herbicides themselves. And many have endorsed Enlist One as a preferred method as a tank mix partner with other herbicides for the control of some of our more difficult weeds in both corn, soybeans, and cotton. Since the launch in 2017, we have achieved 150 million acres have been sprayed with Enlist herbicides, either Enlist One or Enlist Duo. So quite accomplishment over basically an eight-year run. So 8 years of consecutive market share gains. Probably the thing that we're most excited about to share is that not only are our customers planting our Enlist cotton, E3 soybeans, Enlist corn, but 75% of those acres are getting treated with at least one application of Enlist One or Enlist Duo herbicide.
Thank you for that update, Jason. I'm going to take the reins here for a minute and give us some updates from an application standpoint and some of the nuts and bolts of the system. So if we take a bird's eye view of our three crops that have Enlist tolerances, we've got soybeans, corn, which includes PowerCore, PowerCore Ultra, and Vorseed, as well as Enlist cotton. You can see here the traits that you're getting in each bag. So you all know how to read, but I want to walk through each one just to talk through what we're getting out of each one. So 2,4-D choline, obviously, we're getting that tolerance to control those hard to control broadleaves like resistant palmer, resistant water hemp. Glyphosate and glufosinate, we're just widening that spectrum to grab more of those grasses and broadleaves. And then you'll see there that corn also has FOP tolerance for additional grass control. But really, when I think about this from a bird's eye view, what I see here is flexibility. So here we've got the opportunity to really look at our operation, even field by field, and develop a weed control program that is tailored to exactly what we need. Taking it a step further, when we think about what we're going to spray, we have two options. So we have Enlist Duo and Enlist One. There's some differences here, and I want to talk through those. So Enlist One is our straight goods 2,4-D choline. So what we get with that is convenience. It's a lot more flexible in terms of tank mix partners and nozzles. And really, Overall, that's probably about what 90 to 95% of the market is using today. We also have Enlist Duo. So Enlist Duo is going to be a convenient premix of the 2,4-D choline plus glyphosate. And like I said, some people like the convenience of that, but overall, a very small portion of the market is using Duo. So we have made the decision to stop production of Duo. We'll have it for the 26th season, but then after that, it will be out of production. Want to talk through some best management practices for weed control. Now, when you see this list, there's probably not going to be anything that shocks you on here. These are best management practices for any weed control system you might implement. And we do have our application rates up here. So Enlist 1 is going to be a quart per acre or 2 pints. Enlist Duo is 4.75 pints. So like I said, no surprises here, but we are going to dive into each one of these a little bit deeper in the coming slides. When we think about actually controlling a weed height is of utmost importance. And this data here demonstrates that. So you can see we've got 3 different weed species at 3 different heights. And as you move to the right, as weeds get taller, you see that control starts to tail off. And then in the bottom 2, as those are harder to control, obviously. So as we move to the right, those tend to trail off even more. So we're going to talk through some ways we can mitigate that. Kind of taking that chart and putting some visuals behind it, you can see ideally on the left is a 2-inch weed, but even a 2-inch weed has 9 growing points on it, as you can see there. And then as you move to the right, 3 to 4 inches, we've got 14 growing points, 18 growing points. And then the farthest on the right, that weed is about the height of his full hand, but you can't count all the growing points. There's so many. So that's why it's so important to catch these things when they're small. Drought is another thing to be cognizant of. This data we're looking at here was actually a greenhouse trial, and you'll notice that the rates of 2,4-D and glyphosate are lower than we would use in the field. So we've got 1/4 of a rate of 2,4-D and 3/4 of a rate of glyphosate. And the reason we do that is to elicit a response. These percentages are not what you would expect for control out in the field, but we want to be able to see separations in the treatments, which is why we do that in the greenhouse sometimes. So just on its own, 2,4-D is giving you 83% control with no stress, and glyphosate's at 85%. But then what we did is we elicited drought response either before or after the application. So it would be either 7 days before or 7 days after. And what you see here is that neither one of those scenarios are ideal. But if you had to pick between the two, having your drought conditions after an application is made is not as bad as drought conditions before. And the reason that is because if that plant is already drought stressed before you make the application, it's already shutting down. It's already starting to harden off, and those stomata are closing up, and it's just, as you can see, overall less effective. Another thing to pay attention to is making sure we're using full rates of our products for optimal weed control. Now, what we've got here, this is a conglomeration of different trials. As you can see, per species here on this first line, there are, we've got anywhere from one common lamb's quarter has 71 different trials that we've accumulated data from. But overall, the big picture story, as you can see, is that 16-ounce rate of Enlist 1, which is more of a burn down rate, very inconsistent control. And then as we start to bump that rate up to 32 ounces, which is our labeled rate in crop, that control really starts to stabilize. And then taking that a step farther, when we add a tank mix partner, such as glyphosate, you could use glufosinate, that's when we really start to optimize on the control aspect. As far as nozzles, we have a product use guide that has multiple pages of nozzle options. That's one of the nice things about our system is we do have the flexibility to have, you can pretty much find a nozzle that's going to fit your system, maybe one that you already have. And the way this guide is broken down is the green is going to provide your best balance between coverage and drift control, right? Because it's a balance. If you have bowling balls for droplets out there, it's going to stay put, but your coverage is likely going to suffer. So that's what the green is the best balance between those two. If you're in an area that's got more susceptible crops nearby, you might want to look at one of those yellow ranges, and that's going to focus in on a little more drift control. They're going to have a little bit larger droplets, but we've tested them all, and we know that the coverage is still adequate for what we're trying to do. We do want to try to be on the upper end of the pressure range there when you're selecting a nozzle size. And that's for if we have to slow down in the field, turn around, things like that. We want to make sure we're at that upper end so we have a little bit of wiggle room down on the, if we have to go down to the lower end as well. Looking at this a little more visually, so let me set this up. On the left, we've got an AIXR nozzle. Think of that as your Enlist nozzle. On the right is TTI. It's producing an ultra coarse nozzle droplet, and that is the nozzle that's approved for the dicamba system. Now, the TTI is approved for Enlist, and a little bit later, we'll talk through why we might not want to use that type of nozzle with Enlist. But if we compare the two, so on the left, we've got AIXR. That top row, everything's at 10 gallons. So you can see there, just by switching the nozzle from AIXR to TTI, you're losing almost half of your coverage there. Now, same scenario on the bottom, but we increased our GPA to 20, and you can see with that AIXR, we've got almost 40% coverage, which is great. And then on the TTI, we're looking at about 25%, which if you compare that up to the top left, you've doubled your gallons with the TTI, but that's almost the same as if you were doing 10 gallons per acre with the AIXR. So it is doable. It's not ideal. And if you're going to be going out with the gallonage already, we feel like you're making better use of your trip across the field with a nozzle like an AIXR. So what this is looking at is a leaf under a microscope, and we're zooming in on a droplet. So top left is Enlist alone. And what we're looking at is the impact of adding an adjuvant to the tank. So Enlist alone, you can see we had to zoom in to 1500x just to get that droplet in the screen. And as we move to the right and start adding things into the tank, you can see when we add NIS, we can zoom out by half. And you can see how that droplet has spread across the leaf. Now, moving to the bottom, we were able to zoom out yet again to 650x. And you can see that with the COC, it's really starting to spread out, and you can start to see a little bit of penetration there. And then finally, on the bottom right with an MSO, you can see it's very spread out, and you can really see the penetration, and it start to getting into the cuticle of that leaf. So just demonstrating the importance of having an adjuvant. We feel like MSO is the best option, but the other two can do a nice job as well, depending on your scenario. So that's kind of a little bit more in-depth information on our best management practices. Like I said, hopefully there weren't any huge surprises there, but it's always nice to have a refresh on what are the best things we can be doing as we make trips out across the field. So now we're going to switch gears and kind of walk through some of the frequently asked questions that we get. And Jason's going to take the first one and talk to us about AMS and should we be using one, how much, and some of the details around that.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I think it's important with our applications of Enlist 1, Enlist Duo, we need to start with ammonium sulfate. And I'm going to give you the rates first, and then I'm going to circle back to the why. So in many applications, if we're putting Enlist 1 with a loaded glyphosate, we're typically adding 17 pounds per 100 gallon or 2 pounds per acre. That's probably more common. Some cases, if you have really soft water, you might be able to take that down to a 8.5 gallon per 100 gallon. But generally 2 pounds per acre of AMS with Enlist 1 with glyphosate is kind of where we want to land. In situations, maybe we're partnering Enlist 1 with glufosinate or Liberty, then we want to bump that ammonium sulfate from 2 pound per acre up to 3 pound per acre. So you might ask yourself, well, is that really needed? What's the AMS really doing? So ammonium sulfate is ammonium and sulfur. And it's the sulfur component that ties up the calcium, the magnesium, the manganese, the hard water cations in the water solution that would otherwise tie up glyphosate, as well as we typically see many of the herbicides we're applying today as the water in the spray tank gets more acidic, those herbicides become more active and more effective on weed control. The ammonium is really important in the process in which glufosinate works. That ammonium source is needed for that glufosinate molecule or Liberty to work well. But also with some key weed species, the ammonium is really important, helping that herbicide get absorbed into the leaf cuticle as well as translocated out through the weed to get complete control. A couple of those key species that I work with that AMS is really critical for success are things like common lamb's quarter and velvet leaf. So next, if you advance the slide once, you'll see just the kind of gain that's made with the addition of the AMS versus leaving out the AMS in the tank. Next slide. So on the top, we got two graphs. The top graph is regarding water pH. The other at the bottom is the inclusion of AMS versus adding no AMS. This is a greenhouse set of studies, so ideal conditions allows us to take the enlist rate down considerably from what we would use in a field application. Also, by going with a lower use rate, in this case, a half a pint per acre of Enlist 1, it allows us to tease out and differentiate a little bit more of these aspects like water pH. So as you look at 4, that's very acidic, 6.5, that's a bit more neutral, and 9, that's more alkaline, you can see the effect that that water pH is having on the performance of Enlist 1 at that low rate on giant ragweed, horseweed, and Palmer amaranth. But interesting enough, if you look down below, same study in the greenhouse, just looking at the inclusion of AMS versus adding no AMS, simply adding roughly 13 pounds per 100 gallon at a 20-gallon application rate, that AMS alone will provide that level of control of giant ragweed, horseweed, and Palmer amaranth as though you were taking that pH down to a pH of 4. So a couple other things to keep in mind regarding pH. Just know that every time you add glyphosate to your spray tank, you are lowering your pH. When you add Enlist 2,4-D choline or Enlist 1 herbicide to that spray tank, you're also lowering the pH. And then when you add AMS to the tank, you're also lowering the pH. So the key message here is add ammonium sulfate at 2 pounds per acre with glyphosate, 3 pounds per acre with glufosinate, and you're going to be at the pH ranges you need for success. So that moves us to what's kind of that last component in terms of adjuvants that we need to add to make Enlist 1 successful, or if you're using Enlist Duo. Typically, where we use non-onyx surfactant is in situations where we have good soil moisture. The weeds are not under much stress. We have higher relative humidity, 80-90% relative humidity. Then we would more likely use a non-onyx surfactant at a quart per 100. If we're teaming up Enlist 1 with a loaded glyphosate, or we're pairing it up with glufosinate or Liberty, that would be a fairly common recommendation under those set of conditions. However, a lot of you, as we get into the month of June, we start to lose some of that relative humidity, at least in some parts of the country, where we're running much lower relative humidity, maybe 30 to 60% relative humidity levels. Maybe at that point in time, we've been absent of rain and the weeds are a little bit more under drought stress. That's typically where we'll want to go with either a crop oil concentrate or a methylated seed oil at a rate of 1 gallon per 100 gallon. And the reason for that, that Katie already mentioned, is with crop oil concentrate and methylated seed oil, they do a better job of breaking down that cuticular wax that tends to develop on the leaf surface when it's trying to mitigate water loss because of drought and low humidity conditions. So to enable that Enlist herbicide and other herbicides to get into that leaf cuticle, we need the crop oil or the methylated seed oil. One new change that has taken place this year is there is a new formulation of glufosinate, Liberty Ultra. And for Enlist One to meet the drift requirements, we need to partner either an HSCOC, an HSMSO, or a methylated seed oil when we're using Liberty Ultra with Enlist One herbicide. And that's simply to make sure that we're keeping the herbicide in the field of application and not seeing particle drift. Again, Katie touched on this earlier. Basically, NIS is providing a bit more spreading of that droplet. We use that more often in higher humidity conditions. If you need to stick with NIS, but are starting to run under a little bit more drought stress, a little bit more cuticular wax because of low humidity conditions, I would encourage you to maybe go from 0.25% of NIS up to 0.5% of NIS to get a little bit better penetration out of that non-onic surfactant. But as Katie mentioned, in a lot of our geographies, when we start to lose that relative humidity, been absence of rain for a while, we tend to then move more often than to a crop oil concentrate or a methylated seed oil to get that herbicide into the plant better and more effectively than we can with NIS. Really busy chart here. I'm going to do my best without a pointer to kind of explain this. On the horizontal axis, you got nozzle pressure, 20, 40, 60. And then on the vertical axis, as you move from the bottom to the top of the screen, you increase your percent of coverage. Your red bar, solid red bar and your solid black bar are differences in water volume. So as you can see, as you increase your PSI, you have 15 gallon versus 10 gallon. You're going to see an increase in coverage. Just a couple important things about Enlist One herbicide and Enlist Duo. The Colex 2,4-D the 2,4-D choline is what keeps the herbicide from being near zero in terms of volatility. The Colex D serves as a drift reducing agent. So we already have a built-in DRA into Enlist One and Enlist Duo. But if you were to add additional DRA to the tank, let's say you're adding a surfactant that also included a DRA with it, you can see the effect that's going to have with those dashed lines on the screen. So it is going to typically need to be applied at a much higher rate of water volume to offset that coverage that you would have got if you had left out the additional DRA. So the key message here is unless you have a very specific reason, let's say you're up against a very sensitive crop situation where you just need to have additional protection that product stays in the field of application, then maybe additional DRA may be needed in that situation. Or there are certain tank mix partners that are on our enlist.com website that are approved tank mix partners, but do indeed require additional DRA to be added to those. Just know that that's going to impact coverage and therefore typically going to need to increase your water volume to get comparable coverage.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. Kylie, let's take a look at our Q&A box and see if we have any questions to answer yet.
You bet. So we have 3 questions so far. So just a reminder to everyone that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function. And we have one more time that will stop at the end of the webinar to answer questions. So make sure you get those in so that we can get your answer or get answers for you. So Jason and Katie, first question Tom has for us is, what % of Enlist corn acres are receiving an application of a FOP herbicide?
That is a great question. Maybe Katie would know the answer. I don't at this point, but it's very, state, probably see quite a bit of differences amongst states and even within a state. I'm living in Nebraska, And we had a small area in August that sustained quite a bit of wind damage where the enlist corn will likely get planted. So we can use Sure 2 to take out that non-enlist volunteer corn this upcoming season. But again, relative to Nebraska, it's a fairly small geography. But there are areas that are struggling with resistant grass species for glyphosate. Glyphosate's no longer as effective as it once was. Some grasses like barnyard grass, Johnson grass, yellow foxtail, and just having a different mode of action might be a good opportunity for them to have the Enlist corn platform to be able to use FOP chemistry to manage those specific grasses.
Yeah, Jason, I don't have a specific number either, but I would say down here, I'm down in the Southwest. We use a decent amount of those FOP chemistries on enlist corn for Johnson grass control.
Okay. Thank you. Brian has a question and he says, what about using liquid AMS with acidifiers?
We've in research and in practical applications, commercial applications, we've used both dry and liquid AMS sources, and provided we're providing a sufficient amount of appropriate rate to tie up the hard water to have enough ammonium source for our herbicides to work well. Both liquid and dry versions have worked well. We typically haven't seen a need for additional acidifiers beyond just adding ammonium sulfate to the tank. Again, a couple things to always keep in mind is the other products we're putting into the spray tank and their effect on the spray application. And just so you know, if you had a neutral pH of 7, just adding glyphosate alone to that spray tank would take the pH likely from 7 down to 5 pH. So as you add Enlist 1, it'll take the pH down as well, and the ammonium sulfate that would have to look at more unique situations where adding an acidifier would be necessarily required for good performance.
Along those lines, Jason, great lead in to a question we just got from Kevin about what is the ideal or goal pH for water in our Enlist applications?
Yeah, I would say in that 5 to 7 covers a lot of pesticides in general. There are some pesticides like our some of our group 2 herbicides like the ALS chemistry, where if you get too acidic, things like Classic, things like Accent, where if you get it too acidic, you have a shorter period that you need to get those herbicides sprayed off, or that acidic water will break those herbicides down a bit quicker in the spray tank. But generally speaking, 5 to 7 is pretty common pesticide application range for pH.
Okay, great. And then I did answer a question in the chat while you guys were presenting. Victor had a question about where he could find the nozzle guide that you all went over, and you can go to enlist.com and everything you need is at your access right there on the website. All right, those are all the questions we have right now. Again, just a reminder, use the Q&A function. We'll pause one more time at the end for questions, but Katie and Jason, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kylie. And thanks everyone for the questions. We're going to get back into some more of our frequently asked questions. And I'm going to take this one. The question is, why doesn't Corteva promote or support spraying Enlist 1 herbicide alone? And it really boils down to resistance management, right? We only have a certain amount of tools in our toolbox, and we've got to make the most of what we have while we have them and they're still working. So if we take a look at history here, this chart is over time, the number of resistant species by mode of action. So the first thing that jumps out to me is that red line, and that is our ALS chemistry. So ALS chemistries are, as you can see, the most likely to develop resistance. So you see that big jump in the 90s, that is most likely pursuit being used in soybeans. Then if we work our way down to the gray line, that's our atrazine. You can see that really started to jump up in the late 70s, 80s, and has continued to climb. Moving on to green, that's our volunteer corn killers, like we just talked about. Don't get me wrong, they do still work. But when we started ramping up the use of those products, we started seeing lots more grasses that were resistant. And then our blue, the EPSP, if you don't know what that is, that's glyphosate. So you see that really took off in the early 2000s, which makes perfect sense when glyphosate traits were released. And then finally, you can see that dark line is our group 4s. So that's really the story. Is if we look back on history, that's kind of how we ended up where we are today. So we want to steward what we have with Enlist and make sure we're always going out with a tank mix partner and always using those layered residuals in conjunction with our post products. Jason?
Yeah, thank you. So what is the difference between 2,4-D choline and other formulations? We're going to tackle that here momentarily. So the first piece of this, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go to the middle section of this slide. The 2,4-D choline is a much more stable molecule, and I'll get into more detail in the next slides to explain a little bit more in depth. But the choline is a very stable molecule, which gives us near zero volatility, significantly less than what we would experience with a 2,4-D ester or 2,4-D amine. And again, that specific part is coming from the 2,4-D choline molecule. It's just more stable. And then at the very top, the less physical drift, where does that come in? Well, with our Enlist-1 and Enlist-Duo, we also have in both of those formulations ColXD technology, and that is essentially our drift reduction agent, keeping those driftable fines from leaving the field of application. When we pair Enlist-1 or Enlist-Duo with those nozzles that are designed to create less drift, we typically see a 90% reduction in particle drift compared to using traditional 2,4-Ds partnered with maybe prior to Enlist more traditional nozzles like a flat fan nozzle, for example. So again, build in DRA, a much more stable molecule. The other part at the very end as well is Enlist-1 and Enlist-Duo were the first to be reviewed by the EPA that under a more intense scrutiny, evaluating the safety to endangered species. And we passed those tests and therefore we're able to get a renewed label. And I believe our label goes now through January of 2029. But Enlist-1 has been through that more rigorous screening to show that it's safe to use and not negatively impact those endangered species. However, with other 2,4-D formulations, that ESA assessment, that more scrutinized assessment, has not been done yet. But when those products do come up for re-registration, they will be placed under the same scrutiny that Enlist-1 herbicide was. So I'm going to begin with this slide just simply saying we do not ever want to be spraying when the wind direction is going towards susceptible crops, including tomatoes. However, this is just simply demonstrating the value of the DRA in Enlist-1 herbicide and the reduction in particle drift. So at the very top box here, we're seeing basically 2,4-D formulations, 2,4-D amine, and then Enlist-1, which is 2,4-D choline. If you look at the amount of distance required between the application and the tomato plants, you got to have a lot more distance between a 2,4-D application and that tomato plant than what you would with Enlist-1 to not cause crop injury. The other part that we want to communicate as well is going from an XR nozzle to an AIXR nozzle. We can be even, if you would, even closer to that tomato plant with Enlist-1 with an AIXR nozzle than we could with an XR nozzle and not cause damage to that tomato plant. And at the bottom box is just simply showing again those two formulations, 2,4-diamine and Enlist-1, with two different nozzle types and the impact of spray drift on that tomato plant. And as you can see, you got 100%, 80%, 72%, and then down to 40%. So the real winner here is using Enlist-1 paired with an AI exert nozzle can substantially keep our product in place where it's intended to perform and avoid situations of impact to sensitive crops or endangered species. So we're going to start on the left side of the screen, and we're going to start at the top. So 2,4-D acid. So when we apply 2,4-diamine and we get it on that leaf surface, the 2,4-D acid has no charge to it, nor does the amine on the right component. And what happens is the amine piece vaporizes, separating, those two are separating from each other. And 2,4-D acid is the most volatile form of 2,4-D. It's what gives rise to vapor that could negatively volatilize and affect a susceptible crop nearby. Where on the bottom, the 2,4-D choline is much more stable molecule. As we apply it and it gets on that leaf surface, you'll notice the charged 2,4-D acid, there's a negative. If you can see that with the oxygen there, you get a negative charge. If you look at the choline salt, it's got a positive charge to it. As we all know from our days of chemistry, negatives and positives attract each other. And it's that bond that keeps that acid in place, therefore not allowing it to volatilize and negatively impact susceptible crops nearby. On the right, we just basically are saying the same thing, just showing it in a different way. So what we've essentially done is we've applied these three different formulations of 2,4-D. On the left, 2,4-D ester, the middle, 2,4-D amine, and then on the right, 2,4-D choline. And then what we've tried to do is we've tried to capture the vapor loss of those specific products over a period of 70 hours. And that percentage is of what was applied, what percent of that 2,4-D applied were we able to capture in the form of vapor gas. As you can see, 2,4-D choline, very, very low, an increase in vapor loss with 2,4-D amine, and even more significantly with 2,4-D ester. So again, inherently 2,4-D choline is just a much more stable molecule, allowing it to stay in place and causing less risk to neighboring crops. So a couple of things we kind of want to conclude with is one is Corteva is committed to traits like the Enlist traits, committed to developing herbicides that go with those traits, not only with the Enlist platform, but future trait and herbicide options in the future. We also put a lot of money and resources to make sure you're well educated on how to utilize the traits and the herbicides to make most use of those, to get the weed control you're looking for, and yet minimize negative consequences of wildlife, endangered species, or other susceptible crops nearby. Every time you choose to purchase Enlist-1, Enlist Duo, every gallon you're purchasing, we're putting a portion of that back into R&D discovery to bring new traits and new herbicides to you to try to stay ahead of some of your biggest challenges that you're facing. And we're spending $4 million in R&D investment daily to try to provide better solutions for you. So we just want to make sure that we share the kind of investments we are trying to make back into our farmers that are making a conscious decision to buy Enlist-1 and Enlist Duo. So Enlist-1 and Enlist Duo are the only two authorized 2,4-D herbicide formulations that can be legally used on our Enlist crops.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Switching gears a little bit and kind of going back to the nozzle conversation. We touched a little bit on it earlier, but a common question we get is, can I just use my dicamba nozzles to spray my Enlist? And like we talked about earlier, it is labeled. And we're going to get into some visuals here in a little bit of why you might want to make a different decision. Again, just to remind you, we do have a graph of several pages with qualified nozzles that is available online. If you have a local rep, they can probably get you a paper copy of this. But ultimately, when we think about dicamba nozzles, those TTIs are producing an ultra coarse droplet, which is required by the EPA. Now, when we got our label approved for some of the reasons that Jason has talked about, we were allowed to have a little bit smaller droplet, so we could go down to a coarse if we wanted to. Like we talked about earlier, it's a balance, right? Smaller droplets is going to mean better control, but it also has more potential to move off target. So it's important to find a happy medium somewhere in there to achieve what we're trying to achieve by controlling weeds and keeping it on target. When we think about different micron sizes for droplets, everything here on this picture, each leaf has the same amount of spray volume. With each different micron size, we're just dividing it up a little different. So the first one is an extremely coarse droplet. That's 500 microns. That's similar to what you would have with the dicamba system. If we take that down to a 250 micron droplet, you can see you're able to spread it out further across the leaf. Also, as these droplets get smaller, they're less likely to roll off of that leaf surface. And then finally, over on the right is very fine, and you can see the number of droplets we have there. Those are more likely to move off target. Now, taking those same concepts that we just looked at and putting it in action in the field here, on the left, we have our TTI nozzle, the right two are AIXRs. Everything here, it was applied at 20 gallons per acre. So on the right, we're looking at 32 ounces of glufosinate. And we know glufosinate can be kind of finicky, but TTI at 20 gallons per acre for glufosinate. Now, we make one switch moving to that middle picture just by moving to an AIXR. You can see visual differences in control there. Still probably not completely ideal. So if we move one more to the far right, you can see when we add Enlist 1 to the tank, we have another marked step up in control. So using that right nozzle with your 20 gallons per acre, full rates of both, you can see we drastically improved control there. And I should say these are 12 to 16 inch weeds, which are off label. We do not recommend doing that, but it definitely shows what these products are capable of. Jason?
So why bring Enlist herbicide tolerance to corn, and won't that promote resistance? Great question. We'll try to do our best here to tackle that. So with our corn hybrids today, you primarily have traits that allow for glufosinate use or glyphosate use, or many of the hybrids have both glufosinate and glyphosate tolerance in them. But again, somewhat limits the things that you can do from a weed control standpoint. By adding the Enlist trait to corn, it not only allows for the tolerance of glufosinate and glyphosate, but it kind of expands that, giving us the flexibility to partner 2,4-D choline with a glufosinate application, or tank mix of 2,4-D choline with a glyphosate to provide either broader spectrum control or to help us maybe mitigate specific weed species, to be able to do a better job than maybe we would with glufosinate or glyphosate alone on that particular weed species. Also, as we discussed earlier, and Katie mentioned Johnson grass, being a little bit more challenging for glyphosate, allows us to use the FOP chemistry, which are group 1, and very specifically the DIMs. And the one that has been labeled for applications on Enlist corn has been Assure 2. But it gives us a different tool to manage some of those grasses that are becoming more resistant to glyphosate. Also helps us in some situations, as I mentioned earlier, in Nebraska. We had a windstorm where we had corn go down. We're probably going to plant Enlist corn on those acres, and then hopefully use Assure 2 to control that non-Enlist volunteer corn this season. So adding some additional flexibility to the corn farmer is some of the value of going with Enlist corn. The other thing we've noticed with Palmer amaranth becoming a little bit more problematic in some regions, more dicamba use, in crop for the control of palmer. However, especially some of those later applications that dicamba use may create some additional brittleness where we get some snapping of the plants, especially in advance of some winds. We'll see a bit more increased brittleness or breakage with dicamba. And farmers like the convenience of maybe being able to use 2,4-D choline instead of dicamba and to be able to apply it in that situation more safely without creating that brittleness. So again, some additional flexibility there. Also, they like the features of again, the near zero volatility, the reduced physical drift, and also just something really important to note, it takes quite a bit more 2,4-D choline to cause injury to non-enlist soybeans, and it takes just as little as 1 M&M in a 1,000-gallon tank of dicamba to cause injury to soybeans. So again, inherently 2,4-D choline is going to be a little bit more gentle to many of our crops than maybe what we would see with dicamba nearby. So probably the most important discussion, regardless of the traits that you decide to choose to use, is these kind of principles are really important for not only resistance management, but for really achieving the best weed control you can possibly get out in the field. And that's the use of multiple effective modes of action. Whether you're tank mixing herbicides together or buying a premix, it's important to have at least two of the 3 or 4 things you're putting together in the tank to be effective on those more problematic weed species. If you're trying to tackle kochia, water hemp, palmer, giant ragweed, just make sure you're using 2 effective modes of action because many of those weeds that I mentioned also have some challenges with weed resistance. So a really strong pre is really important. We'd really encourage 2/3 to a full rate of a pre. Taking a lot of that pressure off is going to be really important to not only the best weed control, but also best resistance management. So anytime we can use an HPPED, a Group 27 pre in our corn programs, and alternate with a PPO Group 14 chemistry as a pre in our soybeans, that's another way to kind of change things up so our weeds are being exposed to different herbicides. And then when we get to those post applications, if we were to use Enlist corn, maybe we pair Enlist corn, we take Enlist 1, pair it with glyphosate, excuse me, and then maybe add something like a Cairo that has a Group 27 with it. And yet in soybeans, if we're using Enlist E3 soybeans, maybe instead of pairing Enlist 1 up with glyphosate, we're pairing Enlist 1 with glufosinate. So again, it's important to change up the modes and sites of action you're using, both pre and post, have at least 2 effective modes of action, both in pre and post applications. And the last thing that I know Katie's wondering if I'm going to miss is to make sure that in that post application, you're including a residual herbicide. We need to get that control for those later germinating weeds up until we achieve canopy closure. So really important there. While we do have a very high spray rate today on our E3 soybean acres with Enlist, we expect Enlist to get used more in corn, Enlist corn, more as a kind of a rifle approach as opposed to a shotgun approach. So more as needed. Maybe you have a specific weed species. The 2,4-D choline would be particularly good to have in the tank. So again, it'll be used a bit more tactically in corn and probably won't see that same kind of spray rate that we have achieved today in soybeans. So this is a long-term study done by Purdue University. The top is weed density. The bottom graph is weed species changes. And I really want you just to pay attention to the blue line, the light blue line in both charts. What we want to avoid is much the same principles we did with atrazine, the same principles we did with Group 2 herbicides like Pursuit. Same thing we did with glyphosate will happen with Enlist 1 if we only use Enlist 1 as the primary product for weed control. As you can see, Enlist alone, we see more density build over time as we get further out from the first time we used it. We see a bit more changes in weed species with 2,4-D alone. So the key message here is we always need to include other effective tank mix partners when we're putting herbicides together. And that wouldn't apply just for Enlist One or Enlist Duo, but it would apply for other herbicides as well.
Okay. Another question we get is why is glufosinate herbicide not working on weeds with or without Enlist One herbicide? And to tackle that, a couple of things. So we've already mentioned that glufosinate can tend to be finicky. We know that glufosinate is a contact herbicide, so it works best with sun and humidity. So it's important to make sure that when we do go out with glufosinate for resistant management purposes, it needs to be in a tank mix with Enlist One. You don't want to go out, just like Jason finished covering, we don't want to go out with a single product by itself. So just talking through some of the best management practices there. One, in a tank mix with those two, we want to make sure we're using full rates. So here in the Southwest, we recommend 1 quart, Enlist One and glufosinate. Weed height is very important. So 3 inches tall or less. We always want to include AMS, as Jason has already sold us on earlier. Make sure we're within that application window. And then volume is really important with glufosinate. So we recommend 20 gallons per acre when we have glufosinate in the tank. And then, like I said, sun and humidity are really going to be your friends, which in the Southwest, humidity is not always readily available. So that tends to be our limiting factor down here. Jason, another question for you. Does the Enlist weed control system control kochia?
Yes, it will. So get this question a lot, particularly in western states, western Nebraska, western Kansas, down into Texas and into the Dakotas. So the first thing I will say with Liberty alone and Enlist alone, neither are very effective on kochia alone, but we have seen really good performance when we combine Enlist One with Liberty and on kochia that's up at the time of application. Oftentimes, if you're targeting kochia, kind of the sweet spot to control kochia is that 2 to 3 inch kochia. Some of the more difficult to control kochia is when it's in that button size stage, really small and very furry, more challenging to control, or when we're starting to get heights of kochia that exceed 4 inches, it gets a little bit more challenging. We have noticed that when we run Enlist One with Liberty and add either Resource or Cadet to the tank, we have improved our control another step further, especially on some of the larger kochia plants. Ideally, from my perspective, though, I don't want to see things get quite that far. I prefer to use some type of fall applied product. So I'm controlling most of that kochia in the early spring. One of my favorites, if I know I'm going to plant Enlist E3 soybeans in the spring, is I love putting Sonic down in the fall. I'll remove most of that kochia come spring when it's trying to germinate. If I'm maybe didn't get that fall application done and I'm wanting to clean up some of that kochia that's already up prior to planting, which I would highly encourage, I might pair either Sharpen with metribuzin or Gramoxone with metribuzin, two other combinations that are very effective on knocking a lot of that kochia out. And then anything that might have gotten by that treatment or anything that might germinate later, I'm simply going to take out the remaining part of that, typically with Enlist One and Liberty.
What about cupping? Do Enlist soybeans show cupping?
They can. What are some of the contributing reasons why you might see cupping? One, if you have a neighboring application of dicamba where maybe the boom height isn't being maintained, maybe as they're turning around, that boom is being lifted up too high, or maybe because of terrain that boom height is coming up a little bit high, and that wind may, through particle drift, move that to the Enlist field. It'd be particle drift movement, or higher wind speeds, higher than labeled wind speeds, and from a field that's being sprayed next door, that could create some cupping. Also, high dicamba, neighboring dicamba, sprayed under high temperatures as well as low humidity conditions. You could see some damage due to vapor or volatilization. The other thing that's probably underlooked that we see at times is uh, we are using more dicamba with our pre-plant corn programs today, as well as using a bit more dicamba in our post-corn programs. And it's incredibly important as we transition from going from a corn acre to an Enlist soybean acre that we're using that full triple rinse process on the sprayer and making sure we have a commercial cleaner in there to remove all the dicamba that is in the sprayer. Also, in some areas, we do what we call hot loading, where on a trailer bed we have a tank, a pump, and a hose that we premix the herbicides, then pump it off into the sprayer. And it's just important to do a triple rinse there as well, utilizing a commercial cleaner. And that'll remove some of that little bit of dicamba that might remain from that corn application as well. So those are kind of the three primary ways that you can see occasionally some cupping. What we've noticed though, come harvest time, unless it's really severe and severe stunning, we oftentimes find that the soybean yields are as good as we normally expect, in some instances even better than we would have expected.
Great. Thank you for that information, Jason. I'm going to sum us up here and remind you of some of the resources that we have. Kylie's already told you about enlist.com. So there is all kinds of resources on that website, including the product use guide. So this is, you won't be able to see it, but this is the paper copy of our 2026 product use guide, but you can also find that online. We've got an application guide that gives you kind of the things that you should have top of mind before you pull that sprayer out into the field, tank mix guiding, and other literature that we've developed there as well. We also have a YouTube page for Enlist that has like virtual plot tours. There's videos on there for literally any topic you can think of. That YouTube site is very handy. So as far as Corteva as a whole, we have really done our best effort to really steward this technology. We know that tools like this are few and far between, and we want to do the best job we can to try to steward this, to have it for a long time into the future. So we've got management resources, like I mentioned, also local infield experts that can help you with any questions you may have. We continue to do education and training like we're doing today. We feel like that's a very important part of this whole system. And then we're always looking for advancements in technology. So 2,4-D choline is a product of that, as well as the Colex-D technology. Since we launched, we've always been trying to expand our tank mix partners, our nozzle selection, and just looking for ways to make this system more flexible than it already is. So we are proud of our system. We hope that you find value in it on your operation. And I hope you see here that we're here to support you, and we have resources available, whether it be online or in person, to help you be successful. So I want to turn it back over to Kylie one last time to clean up any remaining questions and answers that we may have.
All right. Thanks, Katie and Jason. We are right at the top of the hour, and so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There's only one question in the chat, pretty light on the questions today. And Brian has a really good question on some specifics with tank mixing. So I'm going to go ahead and read it really quick since it's the only question in the chat. And I'll do my best to try to summarize. Brian says, regarding your slide of best management practices with glufosinate and Enlist One, your recommended adjuvant is 1.5 to 3 pounds of AMS. I understand that we need AMS. However, it was mentioned that MSO is the best adjuvant option earlier in the presentation. Can you walk me through MSO, crop oil, and HSOC with glufosinate and Enlist One in the tank? Also, how does adding clethodim in the tank affect your adjuvant decision? And if we need to follow up with Brian in a follow-up, we absolutely can follow up after the fact as well.
Yeah, there's a lot to bite off. I'm
I
going
know.
to take a bit of a stab here. Let's start with ammonium sulfate. Ammonium sulfate is really important for Liberty in terms of how Liberty works within the weed. Ammonium is a key component of that, as well as again, with certain weed species, the ammonium part seems to help herbicides like Enlist, species like velvet leaf, lamb's quarter or two that are well documented that ammonium is really important in helping get that herbicide into the leaf and helping with the ammonium move better within that weed or being translocated better in that weed so we get better weed control. So unless you really have really soft water to begin with, generally we recommend, more of that 3 pound per acre of AMS with Enlist One with glufosinate. The other thing I would just say for what it's worth, your group one herbicides, your grass killers, will also typically work better with the inclusion of ammonium sulfate. That has been well documented over the years and well observed. So it's crucial for that as well. Typically when we're adding a grass killer to that combination of, let's say, Enlist One and glufosinate, to help crop, the group one herbicides do tend to struggle getting into that leaf cuticle and generally need a little bit more assistance. And that's where we usually run a gallon per hundred of crop oil or a gallon per hundred of methylated seed oil. Probably the only time I would deviate with that 1% volume to volume or 1 gallon per 100 gallon is if I'm putting a residual herbicide in the tank that is an EC formulation, like an Everprex, an Outlook, something that is an EC formulation. Maybe in those instances, I'll drop that rate from a gallon per 100 gallon down to a half a gallon per 100. But again, a lot of that depends on your relative humidity. This is probably very much an oversimplification, but generally, it doesn't take as much to get the herbicide into the leaf tissue when you have relative humidity in that 80 to 90%. When you start getting in that 30 to 40% relative humidity range, you're more likely going to need a crop oil. As you get between 60 and 80, that gives you a little bit more flexibility to go one way or the other, depending on, is a little bit of less crop response from the oil more important to me, and I'm willing to give up a little bit of volunteer corn control, or is volunteer corn control more critical for me than maybe seeing a little bit more leaf burn from that oil itself. So hopefully that helps. Water volume tends to help that as well. If you're running something like 10 gallon versus going to 20 gallon, just a little bit more water volume as a whole, especially if you're adding residual herbicides that have an EC formulation, running a little bit more water volume tends to dilute that burning effect a little bit as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks, Jason. The only thing I would add to that is, Brian that asked the question and just everyone who's listening in, this is a great question to take to your local Corteva rep, because we found differences in recommendations based, to Jason's point, based off of environment, what's in the tank, what you're trying to accomplish, all of those good things. And so Jason absolutely nailed it with his answer. And I would just say, from a follow-up perspective, follow up with your local retailer or your local Corteva rep to get you a little more specifics and a little more in the weeds, depending on what is in the tank and what you're trying to accomplish. So,
Yeah, Katie or Kylie, on that note, you brought up we're trying to be a resource today. We have enlist.com, Corteva.us, great resources for you to learn about the Enlist system. But one of the things that shouldn't be superseded is the value of your conversation with your local retailer, your crop consultants that you might be working with. Those people are excellent resources as well. Some of your university folks that are very engaged in extension, run some of these things by them as well. There's other really good resources as well as Corteva to rely upon.
absolutely. All right. Well, we are a little over time. Thanks for hanging in here with us for an extra 5 minutes. But Brian had a really great question there at the end, and Jason nailed the answer to it as well. So Did just want to say thank you again for your time today. Katie and Jason, thank you for everything you covered. You guys did a fantastic job. If you have any follow-up questions, be sure to let us know. I would say we'd follow up with questions in the chat that we didn't get answered, but we got everything tackled today. It was light on the questions. So with that, we are going to wrap this up. Again, thank you very much, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.